Now, tonight's guest speaker, Dr. William Leffler. Dr. Leffler has spent 36 years of oil industry experience in exploration, production, petrochemicals, refining, marketing, and transportation sectors as a manager, a consultant, a strategist, and other executive positions for the Royal Dutch Shell companies. Leffler has written or co-authored a number of books which have become industry standards, including, and these books all have something in common, see if you can figure it out, Petroleum Refining in Non-Technical Language, Petrochemicals in Non-Technical Language, Deep Water Exploration and Production, a Non-Technical Guide, Oil and Gas Pipeline in Non-Technical Language, Oil and Gas Production in Non-Technical Language, Natural Gas Liquids in Non-Technical Language. So the kind of books that we all can understand. Over 140,000 copies of these books have been sold. He earned a BS and MIT. He earned a BS from MIT and an MBA and a PhD from New York University, and is currently a consultant, a writer, and educator. Please welcome to the podium Dr. William Leffler.
Thank you, Warren. My mother would have been proud for that introduction. Thank you. And I'm pleased to be here at this wonderful institute. I took the tour this afternoon. Warren told me about every single exhibit they have here, and it was really fascinating. I wanted to write a book entitled The Third Wave. And so I got two other authors to go along with me, and we wrote the book, published the first edition in about 2002, published the second edition in about 2008, and sent both of those off in sequence to the publisher. And what they did, of course, was to change the title to Deep Water Petroleum Exploration and Production, a Non-Technical Guide by W.L. Leffler et al. Well, Al is not here tonight, so I get to give a talk called The Third Wave, all right? So we're going to be talking today. Well, before I start that, I always like to start this discussion with this picture. This is a picture of the Brent platform in the North Sea. And you can tell it's kind of a stormy night. That Brent platform was built so that the bottom of the platform was 80 feet above mean tide. And if you'll notice on this stormy night, there was a wave just touching the bottom of that platform. It gives you a clue as to what goes on in the offshore development of oil and gas. When I look at that picture, the first question that always comes to my mind is, who took the picture? But the theme of my talk tonight is going to be the learning curve, because that is the notion that I think describes what has happened as the oil industry went into the offshore. Knowledge on this scale, depth or years on that scale, and like many other learning processes, starts off slow, accelerates, and increases very rapidly. And then you've learned almost everything there is to learn about that subject, and it kind of tapers off. And I'll talk to you about where we are on that learning curve in the offshore. I want to start 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, when the first toe went into the water by an oil man, a fellow named H.L. Williams, who was a spiritualist and sometimes wildcatter in Summerland, California, a town that he founded. Noticed there were oil seeps near the beach, and so he followed those oil seeps all the way down to the water and decided that it may be a prospect that he wanted to develop. So he started to build piers out into the water. Some of them went as far as 450 feet out into the water, but it was still only 30 feet deep. And then he would go out and he would set a casing down there and pound his way down about 450 feet again. And then he found oil. And he did this about 40 or 50 times. The largest of the wells that he was able to produce produced about 75 barrels a day. The average was about 2 barrels a day. After he played that field out after about 10 years, he decided that was enough, and he walked away from it and left it there, including all the equipment and oil that was on the beach because of the equipment leaking and so on. And a number of other entrepreneurs did the same thing, maybe 20 or 30 of them further on up the beach. It's no wonder that California doesn't really look all that excited about offshore development in the Pacific Ocean. Those piers lasted until 1942 and continuously deteriorated until a storm came in and just blew them all away. But that was a start of going into the offshore. Now, usually when you think of the offshore, you think of boundless oceans and waves and so on. But the real next really interesting part of the development in the water took place not too far from here in Lake Caddo, 1907. There was a scout from Gulf Oil who suspected that there was a lot of gas underneath Lake Caddo because he had heard a lot of stories about the smell that was out there. And so one night he got in a rowboat and he used an interesting device to detect whether or not there was gas because he heard about the bubbles that were coming up. And as he rowed across there, he would light a match and see if he could ignite one of those bubbles. And sure enough, he was able to avoid self-immolation. And he went back to Gulf back to Mr. Mellon up in Pittsburgh and said, I think we have a big find. And sure enough, they dragged a whole bunch of equipment up the Mississippi and the Red River and built all these platforms here and produced about 80 million barrels out of equivalent barrels of oil and gas out of that find. But it was the first time we had a standalone platform in the middle of the water. I'm going to jump forward about 40 years to 1947, when Superior Oil decided that they, after doing some seismic work offshore, they thought that they ought to drill an exploratory well in the Gulf of Mexico. About 40 miles out. It was still only about 35 feet deep at that point. But they said, you know, building something out there would not be all that easy to do. Why don't we build this platform onshore and drag it out there and set it down and drive some piles in and put it in place. And that was the first time they built an exploratory well out of land site. Unfortunately for them, right down the coast was a operation done by Kerr McGee. And they had a little bit different attitude towards building. They also fabricated something onshore and dragged it out, but it was only about a fifth of the size of the platform that was built here by McDermott for Superior. What they had was a big tender, which was, turns out it was a surplus LSD from World War II. And they had all the equipment that they needed to do the drilling over there, and the platform was on, the drilling rig was just on this little tiny platform. Unfortunately for Superior, this little operation grabbed the brass ring before they did, and they were the first oil produced in the Gulf of Mexico out of land site. And that was in 1947. They beat these guys by about 3 months, but they got the brass ring. You know, when you go to drill an exploratory well, if you build a platform like that, you drill it, and if you find something that's fine, you can produce there. But if you want to drill another exploratory well, you got to build another platform. So they thought about that, the oil industry did, and they said, you know, what we need is something where you can pick it up and move it someplace. And that's when they started to think about submersibles. One of the first submersibles that was built was the Breton rig number 20 in 1949. And what that rig did there, these pontoons on the side were raised up, and this pontoon here was raised up, but you drag it out, and then you would start to ballast those until they actually sat on the ground. And as they sat on the ground, you would lift that platform, so the platform was always above the water. And then you would have your drilling rig on top of that. So that was the first mobile offshore drilling unit that got put into service. Mr. Charlie, another one that came a couple of years later, had hinged pontoons on it, and because The difficulty here was making sure that when it settled down, it didn't tilt and destroy the integrity of all of the works that were hinging everything going down. And so this one here, this pontoon here would hinge all the way up here, and this one would hinge all the way up there. And the way they got that on the bottom, and here we're talking about 40 feet getting it down, it would be like an old man getting into an automobile. He would get that part in first, right? And so what they would do is they would lower this pontoon down, and this would be on a tilt, and when they hit bottom, then they would have leverage to fill up the other pontoon and get that one down, and then they still had the drilling rig on top of there, and they could do that. It wasn't long before Kerr McGee said, you know, we ought to be able to build something where we could go much deeper than just 40 feet. I mean, we need to get into 100 or 150 or even more feet. And so Kerr McGee built one of these, and what they had was these big, it was a triangular shape with these big steel bottles on there. And while they were pulling it out to another place, of course, they would deballast these bottles, and everything would be floating, and that worked just fine. But they were very expensive to build because there's a lot of steel in those things, and difficult to move around as well, and not all that steady in a rough sea. So along comes a couple of people talking about, well, maybe what we need to do is to not have those big bottles around anymore, but maybe we could do it in a way where we could get the platform out there and drop something down so we could have a firm place where we could do the drilling. DeLong built one, had one built by McDermott, and they could go into 30 feet of water, and what they had was this bottle here, and while they were pulling it, of course, these bottles were way up in the air like this, and they could pull that out and then just crank down those big bottles and sit it down there. They'd have a nice stable place to do it. So they could actually get into deeper water, as Mr. Gus did. He got into 100 feet of water because this bottle here could be dropped way, way down. This actually wasn't a jack up. This was a jack down, because this bottle here, while they were floating around, was right up against the platform itself. That one lasted about 2 or 3 years, because on one occasion, as they were dropping that jack down, one of the bottles started to crater, and it tilted over. They took it back and fixed that and brought it out again, and it actually capsized when they got all that stuff in there, and they lost interest in doing jack downs anymore, and they said, maybe we ought to stick with jack ups. That's when the Zapata Corporation came along and had a novel rig offered to them by a fellow named Letourneau. That's it, R.G. Letourneau. Letourneau had worked half of a career in the earth-moving business, and he knew a lot about machinery. And so what he designed was a rig here that didn't have these steel bottles, but had a lattice on it. And you could crank those up because they used a rack and pinion kind of an operation to crank those things up and crank those things down. Matter of fact, there's a model of one that looks just very similar to that somewhere in this building. They call it the Scorpion, and he started to peddle it around. Couldn't find any of the major oil companies that wanted to use it. But he did find one very aggressive independent called Zapata Corporation, and they said, yeah, we'll try it out. And sure enough, what they did was they tried it out, and they brought it out, and were able to drill in 150 feet of water. Matter of fact, I've got a picture. Let's see, I got a picture here of the guys who were on that rig. One of whom worked for Zapata Corporation. You can tell because of the socks what his name might be. Standing there talking to Hugh Lidke and another one of his buddies. But these operations, there's the Scorpion right there. You can see the kinds of jack down legs that they would put, and here they're not in very deep water, so most of the leg is above there, and about half of it is down below, so that's probably in about 75 feet of water when they were drilling. So they were able to move these things around very rapidly. After they finished one well, they could jack those legs up and move them off to another location in just 2 or 3 days, as opposed to having to build another rig to do an exploration well. If they find something, then they would come out and build a platform because they know they were going to make money there. These operations here, these submersibles, lasted a long time, but there was a fellow named Bruce Collop who was riding on one of these submersibles. He was called the Blue Water. And they were towing it from one location to another, and they got into very rough weather. And so the captain who was in charge of towing it from one to another said, you know, we're in danger of capsizing because of all the weight that we have at the water level. I think what I'll do while we're towing it is I will submerge this thing a little bit. It'll be a much slower tow, but it'll provide us some stability. And Bruce Collop, who was probably the only marine engineer or naval architect that was working in the oil industry at the time, happened to be on board. And he noticed that when he dropped that thing down into the water and was still towing it, that it got very stable. And he said to himself, I've got an idea. And he said, you know, the problem with these rigs is that they get unstable when you're moving them around, but if you just drop these bottles down, then maybe we can do something with that. So he made a design. The design was based on this thought, that if you want to keep something stable, then what you needed to do is just control these things here: pitch, roll, heave, surge, sway, yaw. There's pitch, there's roll, there's heave, there's sway, there's surge, there's yaw. You know, I get seasick just looking at this chart here. But there's the platform up there with the rig on top. And he said, you know, you can eliminate almost all of that if you just drop those pontoons way down. He said about halfway down would do it. As a matter of fact, when he went to the Coast Guard to get a license for this thing that they did with the Blue Water when they converted it, the commandant down in New Orleans said, well, what do you call this thing? And he's saying, well, I don't want to call it an ocean-going vessel because that means we have the Jones Act and all that sort of stuff. He says, well, I don't know what to call it because we only submerge it about halfway down. So the commandant said, oh, it's not a submersible? He said, no, it's only a semi-submersible. The guy wrote down semi-submersible, and a new class of drilling rigs was born. Of course, we have gone a long way from that. Instead of having all these tethers keeping these things in place so you can do the drilling, well, of course, now we have something like the Nautilus, and you do it all by GPS positioning and having jets along the side so that the GPS is directing the jets which way to push the thing back and forth so that you're only moving a couple of feet in each direction while you're doing the drilling. So again, there was another innovation that moved the industry along and got us to be drilling not in 100 feet or 175 feet, but we're now able to drill in 200 and 300 and 400 feet. Another innovation that came along about that time, after a couple of false starts, was something called the Eureka. It was a drill ship. And you say, well, how do you keep a drill ship on point? I mean, you could tether that down as well, but the designers of the Eureka said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to put some kind of an apparatus on there called a tilt meter. That tilt meter went from the top of that rig up there all the way down to where we were drilling. And they had a sensitive directional indicator on there so that when the ship moved in this direction, the guys down on board ship would be able to tell you, moving in that direction, you need to move in that direction. Well, how do they go about doing that? Well, they had a retractable Harbor Master propulsion unit up in the front, which they operated with a joystick. And it could move back and forth, and then they had the stern Harbor Master propulsion unit, and they could move it forward and back. So that worked for about a year until they found out that actually they wore out both the joystick and the forward propulsion unit, and so they had to say, you know, we need a little bit better kind of an operation than that. But that was the first drill ship that actually they didn't drill any exploration wells, but they did drill a lot of coring wells where they would get down and find out really what is within the subsurface. Now, of course, we have the drill ship Discoverer, capable of drilling in 10,000 feet of water to a depth of 35,000 feet. You've got this huge derrick on top that's designed to handle the kind of tubulars that you have to use to get down to 35,000 feet. So it has to be able to handle 1,000 pounds, be able to pull 1,000 pounds out of that well. And this, of course, is also done by GPS positioning and side thrusters all along both sides of that ship. So we started small and learned our way into how to deal with drilling ships. And if you look at what we're doing today, a drill ship can drill anywhere from 500 to 12,000 feet. It's hard if you get less than 500 feet because the ship will move a little bit and you don't have all that much give in that line that's going down. But when you're drilling in 12,000 feet, you start drilling up here and you turn it around about 4 or 5 times before the bottom starts to move. I mean, that's 12,000 feet of pipe. And so there's a lot of torque that has to be taken up before you actually start turning to the right. Jack-up rigs really peaked out at about 400 feet, and semi-submersibles, well, they're used either from 200 to 10,000 feet as well in today's commerce. Okay, so those are all exploration kinds of operations. You're going out there to find out where the oil is. And having found something, what do? You've got to put a production system in place. You don't want to use a drill ship to do any production. You don't want to use one of these to do any production, although some people have done that once in a while. But what you want is a permanent place where you can produce for about 10 to 20 years. And so you want to design something to put in place. That one, which was an exploration well, turned out to be also the production facility because it was there. But I want to jump forward from 1947 again, where we started to get into deeper and deeper water. So here we are in 1,000 feet of water when Shell put the Cognac platform in place. And as we go forward, year by year, we're getting into deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper water by putting these very large platforms in place. It's hard to appreciate how much steel goes into a platform like that. I mean, 1,353 feet of water, and you're putting a platform in place that'll support a drilling rig and all of its complementary equipment on board. But you get some sense of that when you see, this of course was fabricated onshore and dragged out there. You get some sense of what that looked like when you see them drag it out. There's that hotel down on the shore in Corpus Christi, and there's the platform Bullwinkle being towed out to sea. So when you drag that out there, what do you do with it when you get it onto the site where you have discovered something? Well, you got to get it out there, and you got to get it right on top of those wells that you have already drilled. And you're facing this kind of environment when you're out there. I mean, how would you like to be on that platform out there when you saw these water spouts heading towards you during Hurricane Lily? I mean, if I were on that boat, I think I'd be going that way. I don't know about you, but it doesn't look like a lot of fun to me. But when you get that platform out there, and it's on a barge, what you do is you slip that platform right off the back. Now, you may think that it's going to go right down, but there is ballast in all of these tubes that are going along here. So what happens is as you slide it off, that platform will actually float. At least you hope it will. And then you move it around and position it so that, oh, and there you are, you're floating 49,000 tons of material. And so you take that barge out, and you slip it off the barge, and then it's floating, and then you start to ballast those tubes that are on there very carefully, and so that the bottom will start to move in that direction, and if you do it exactly right, it'll settle down right on the seafloor on those pads that you've already put down there so that it'll sit there. Now, 49,000 tons, you say, well, it's going to sit there forever, but of course, and the hurricanes come in, it may not sit there forever. So what you do is you put steel pilings in there that go down 150, 200 feet. You drive those down through those legs there, right? So you may call that a platform, but generally in the industry, they call those jackets. Now, why would you call something like that a jacket? Well, the jacket is one where you have the equivalent of a zipper or a button, where you're driving those piles way, way down there, okay? So now you have the jacket in place, but nothing on top. So now you have to construct the top sides, and you construct them on a little rail line so that you can run them out onto that barge. And the top sides themselves, 2,000 tons. And so you got to drag that out to the platform, to the jacket, and then you have to have a really large crane, to be able to pick it up and set it down right on top of the jacket. And when you're all done, the Bullwinkle looked like that, mated with the top sides and all the equipment that's on there. So all the equipment was brought out in one piece and just set on there and welded in place. Now, when Bullwinkle was put in place, there were a number of other exploration finds a little bit further out. Here's a profile of what the onshore and the offshore and the deep water and what they call the abyssal plain way out there, where you get beyond 12,000 feet of water. And here's the Bullwinkle at 13,000 feet, and here are discoveries along here and here and here and here. The bottom of Bullwinkle was 400 square feet, 400 feet square, 1,600 square feet, but 400. And the thought of putting another platform here in, say, 2,000 feet of water was more than anybody really wanted to take on. Just too much steel to make it really commercial. And so, what are we going to do about that? There was a mechanical challenge. You know, the difference between exploration and production people is profound. You know, the exploration people, I always like to think of them as having a real big bulge on their right brain, and the production people having a real big bulge on their left brain. So when the exploration people, they go out and they say, we'll go out to where we think it's hard to find oil, but we know how to find it. And they say, well, how are we going to produce it? They'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. And so, you know, this brain going, oh, and this brain going, don't worry about it. So having found all these deposits, large reservoirs out here beyond 1,300 feet, the production people had to start thinking about how are we going to be able to do that. So they had to come up with something besides platforms where you hold the platform up. And more innovation required. The geologic challenge at the same time for this deep water kinds of stuff, the conventional wisdom in 1984, and this is a quote from one of the exploration guys at Shell, as a matter of fact, there is no sand beyond the shelf. 100 wells have penetrated the Bethel section, have found no sand. But there were a couple of explorers out there who said, you know, I think we can probably find something big enough to make it commercial. So there was skepticism about whether or not it was commercial because nobody tried to produce it, and there was skepticism because nobody knew how to produce it. So they had to work together between exploration and production. At this point, I think, in my alleged mind, I think of this as being the end of the second wave. Well, what do I mean, the second wave? The first wave was the onshore wave. It started way back about, 1,000 years ago, where people were picking seeps of oil out of the ground, and the Chinese were piping oil, gas leaks into the palaces to light. But really, it kind of started in 1859 when Drake drilled the first oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and kicked off the oil age. Well, there was a lot of learning going on after that, and by 1915, they were using rotary rigs and diamond bits and perfected drilling mud and did geologic surveys. And even started doing seismic back here in the 1930s. But by about 1940, much of what was to be learned on the onshore had been learned. But the second wave was just starting back here in Summerland, and then Kerr-McGee's Creole platform, and then they started using submersibles and then semi-submersibles and drill ships and subsea wells, and they were using bright spots and seismic and 3D computing and Bullwinkle. But by the time they got to Bullwinkle, that second wave, they were kind of worried about whether or not that was the end of the second wave. In addition to that, in the Gulf of Mexico, they weren't finding very much on the shelf. The amount of discoveries was not as much, about the same as the amount of production, and so the reserves were just kind of flattening out. And people were worried about whether or not there was much more in the Gulf of Mexico, and they started calling it the Dead Sea. And so the explorers kept saying, yeah, but we think there's a lot of stuff out there in the deep water. And the production guys said, we got to think about that for a while, because we don't have the technology yet to be able to go in beyond 1,353 feet. So the keys to the profitability of the deep water in the Gulf of Mexico and other offshores, there were about 4 things that were taking place. The nature of the reservoirs. Turns out that people started to understand what happened when all of that sediment came down from the ancient rivers into the offshore, that it actually made its way out into the deep water. Nobody thought that when that sediment went out there, that there was any organic material in there that would eventually transform into oil and gas. But, but 1 or 2 companies, Shell might have been one of them, took the chance that these turbidite sands that were covered over with millions of years of sediment on top of them, and they were down 30,000 feet, they might have very prolific reservoirs down there. And so they put a platform out there and tested it and found out that those turbidite sands were very prolific. You can see the sediment coming down, of course, and in case you don't talk to the same guys I talk to. It all comes down these rivers and comes off into the delta, and a lot of that really fine sand made it down to the slope where the deep water is. And dragging with it copious amounts of organic material, and besides that, there was plenty of organic material that was dropping along with these sands out of the water. So there were huge reservoirs out there eventually demonstrated, and they were very easy to produce once you were able to get something on top of them that was able to tap them. The second thing, advances in 3D seismic reduced the uncertainty about the reservoir size and configuration. Seismic started in a very modest way. After World War I, where they were using seismic to figure out where people's artillery was on both sides of the line, then a lot of those people, and one of them was named, what was his name again? Schlumberger. You remember that name. Came over and started developing seismic for understanding what is in the subsurface. Started off very modest. Here's the offshore seismic operation around 1934. And of course, what they had to do is to lay these phones out in the water, piece by piece by piece by piece, and then they would capture the sound after they lit a couple of sticks of dynamite and threw them over. And what would happen is that the dynamite would explode and send sound waves down, and those phones would pick up the echoes as it came back, and then they were able to draw things like this. And if you look at that closely, you say, well, there's a really interesting formation in here. Matter of fact, if that was on the surface, you might call it spindle top. And so they say, there could be a lot, excuse me, a lot of oil and gas along these pieces here. Well, seismic, it was a 2D seismic record. And we used those for decades, 2D seismic records, until Exxon came along and said, we've tried to figure out whether or not we can do 3D seismic records. Instead of just running a line down here, we run a line here, 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 and then see if we can make sense of all those individual lines. In 1984, this was the kind of stuff that you did. This is an actual document used by the guys who developed the auger platform. And they say, you know, we got this big layer of salt here, and we got this thing that looks like from seismic records, there's a lot of oil and gas down there. Why don't we try it? Well, of course, what they were looking at was something like this. This is a later enhancement of those 2D seismic records. And what they were able to discern was that this, in fact, was an oil layer, and this was a gas layer, and here's another oil layer here. And this is a big pillar of salt that oozed up from the salt layers that were way down in the bottom of the subsea and trapped all this oil up against this impervious salt column. Well, that's a 2D version of it. And now, of course, we're able to do a 3D version of it because we have 3D seismic vessels. And what those seismic vessels would do would be to drag multiple lines behind them. You can see them out there. They might go for about 3 miles. And then, of course, they didn't throw dynamite over anymore because, you know, nobody would really like to see all those dead fish float up to the surface. But what they use now is a more benign way of sending off a signal. They have a big air can, and it's like popping a balloon. Boom! And that would send a signal down, and those signals would bounce off all the layers underneath, and you'd be able to draw 3D operation. Now, here was a visualization room where disciplines, there would be geologists and geophysicists and physicists, and there'd be petroleum engineers, and they would all gather in the rooms. You can see this is 1998 because this guy's wearing a suit. This guy's got a tie on, so it must be 1998, right? But they would all be looking at this kind of stuff, and eventually they would take this kind of thing and be able to transform it into something that looks like this in 3D. And here you see that big pillar of salt, and you can see the wells that have already been drilled, and they actually found something on the other side of that pillar of salt and were able to directionally drill down into that formation down there and produce additional oil and gas. So they started off very modestly, you know, with throwing the dynamite over and capturing it on those hydrophones that they had planted by hand, until now we're at 3D seismic by having those seismic vessels. That auger platform that they thought, you know, might have something there, they were able to produce first oil in 1994, and since then they have produced 350 million barrels of oil from that thing, from those rudimentary kinds of 3D. And now they're going back and looking at all of these fields with rudimentary 2D, and now they're going back and looking at 3D and redeveloping many of those fields that are out in the Gulf. Finally, what made the Gulf of Mexico was the innovative low-cost development systems. Tension leg platforms, floating platform ships, floating platform and storage and offloading ships, spars, and long-reach subsea tiebacks. What is all that stuff? Well, I'll tell you what all that stuff is, in case you were wondering. Tension leg platforms. Rather than to try to put a platform on there and put a jacket down there and put a platform on top with the jacket holding it up, so we can't do that anymore. What we need to do is to have a floating platform being held down. And so you have something called a tension leg platform. There is the platform up there. It's got some tubes up there, pontoons that are semi-filled, like a semi-submersible. And then they have these tendons that are attached to big anchor places down in this, at the floor of the ocean. And so that will stay in place. It will move back and forth. Not very much, but it will move back and forth. But if this is in 4,000 or 8,000 feet of water, that pipe, you know, will move with it. There's a lot of give in that pipe in 4,000 feet. You can move quite a bit. One of the early ones, okay, so in the meantime, besides the Gulf of Mexico, you know, the Americans can't take a victory lap without tipping their hat to what was going on in Brazil at the same time, because Petrobras had discovered oil back here in they had discovered it considerably earlier in 1977 in 300 feet of water, and they put a floater there, and then successively they started finding oil in deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper water. And so Petrobras, in parallel to what was going on in the United States, was drilling in deeper and putting floaters on there. And some of them were tension link platforms. Some of them were floating production, storage, and offshore and offloading vessels. And we'll see those in a moment. So you can see the scope of that. There's, what's the name of that mountain down there in Brazil? Yeah, that's the one, right. Whatever he said, that's what it is. Okay, so we were off the subject of Brazil, and we were talking about tension link platforms. And so the U.S. learned from Brazil, Brazil learned from the U.S., but the first big tension link platform was the Auger platform, the one that I told you that was producing a lot. It's also called the tension link platform that ate New Orleans, because that's the platform superimposed on New Orleans to give you some size of the scope of these kind of things. Shell was so nervous about whether or not that thing would stay in place that they ran tethers all the way out 2 miles this way and 2 miles in every direction to hold it in place. But it turns out that they learned that they didn't need to do that, because these tethers here, these lines here that were down into the suction piles that were in this floor, held it just fine. And so subsequent TLPs that are put in the Gulf of Mexico don't have these yellow lines, they just have those red lines. And you can see there is the riser in which the lines are, the wells are coming up through that riser, going up to that platform. And then when it gets to the platform, the oil and gas are treated, and then they go down a pipeline, and then they go onshore. That is an example of, I think that is, I forget what platform, what topsides that is, but it's being dragged out on a big ship built just to drag these things out to the jackets and put them on place. There are other kinds of, besides the tension link platforms, there are the smaller tension link platforms, but there are also things like floating production, storage, and offloading ships. And there, if you aren't in a position to pipeline the stuff from the platform onto the onshore, or you're in an area of some unfriendly company and you don't want to bring it onshore, then you might use something like a floating production, storage, and offloading ship. And there you have actually all the valves, the Christmas trees, they call wet trees, all the valves that control the well on the floor of the sea. And they are controlled from up here by lines, electrical and hydraulic lines that are run down there. So you're not controlling anything, you're not controlling the valves in the production up here, you're controlling the production down here remotely. Let's see. There's a picture of one in the North Sea, the Anasuria. And so the way those things work is you have a rotating facility up here, and so when the wind blows the other way, the ship will rotate right around that so that this part is always connected down here. So it's on a big swivel, and the wind can blow that ship all the way around. But the operation is that there's a big storage facility, and the largest and the newest of these ships can hold up to 2 million barrels of oil as they're pumping it out of the ground. And every once in a while, every day or two, a lightering ship will come along and unload the oil from that and bring it to some place where it's very friendly to unload. Oh, and there's the reasons. I forgot that I use this one when I teach at the University of Houston. You have to show them as well as tell them, otherwise they won't remember. Okay, so there's another one. Now come on. There's another one with the swivel that hangs off the end. It does the same kind of thing. And there's a lightering ship that's unloading that ship from the oil that is already produced. On the subsea, you've got all sorts of things to produce that oil. Here are the subsea wellheads. That's the valves and everything that you needed down there in order to control the production. Over here, now we're getting into really deep water where it's very difficult for that oil to make it all the way up to the surface. I mean, the reservoir has a lot of pressure in it, but maybe not enough pressure to get up 12,000 feet. So what they're doing down here is they have a subsea boosting system. So it's like a big pump. And they also are doing subsea separation, separate the oil and the gas from the water that comes out of that well, so that the oil and the gas can make it all the way up to the top of the surface, again, moving it all the way up to 12,000 feet. So these are techniques to make subsea wells in deep water commercial, and that you can produce most of the stuff that's in that reservoir that's down there, another 35,000 feet. Let's see, what do we have here? Oh, spars. What is a spar? A spar is something like that. It's a big, big tube. Again, there's that little hotel out there. They go to build this big, big tube and bring it out and set it down. Now, why do you do that? Because it's a different way of providing the stability for putting a platform on place. You launch it just like you did those jackets before, and then you come out and you put the top sides on it with this big old lifting facility over here. You just drop it right on top of there, weld it down, and then you've got a producing facility like this spar right here. And that is also tethered straight down, and you can drill from this one as well as produce from that one. And then there are floating production systems. Here's one called the Nakika. Each of these fields here, there are 6 fields here. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fields. None of them was big enough to warrant putting a production facility on top of it. Fortunately, they were all natural gas, and so when we produced those from with subsea development, you know, this is a 50-mile by about 70 miles, so 350 square miles of stuff. That gas was high enough pressure that it could all go to this single host platform and be processed there and then pumped onshore. So these are somewhere between 30 and 50 miles away from the host platform. And they're all connected by electrical and hydraulic systems, so you can control all those valves. I'm getting towards the end, okay? You can see what the history of oil production in the world is. World oil production, wiggling along here. Offshore production, really increasing to maybe 55% of the total world oil production. But starting at about 1980, the shallow water, like the stuff that we had been producing in the Gulf of Mexico, started to taper off, but the deep water has been increasing. And so you can see the wiggle that goes on there to sustain offshore production. Oh, it even gets bigger, okay. That's why I call it the third wave. Let's see, because it's not the stuff that you did here, it's not the stuff that you did here. What we have is better geological and geophysical understanding of the deep water, which is very different than in many places than the more shallow water. We have the innovative facilities, the tension lake platforms, the floating production and storage and offloading operations, and the spars, and the heavy lift vessels, which were key to being able to do those things economically. And we have subsea processing, and we have riser technology, which I didn't show you much about, but in order to get the stuff all the way up to the top. And who knows what's coming? Who knows when that curve is going to bend over? But that's why I say we're in the middle of the third wave, somewhere along here, and I don't know when it's going to bend over, but that's my story. One last thing. Safety, mission critical. Every oil company, every service company has learned that safety is mission critical, because what everybody wants to avoid is that kind of catastrophic operation, which will threaten the largest of the companies and wipe out the smallest of the companies. This is the Deepwater Horizon at the Prospect Macondo. And I don't know who was to blame for what, but I know that the billions of dollars that the participants in this are having to pay are done because not enough attention was paid to safety. But there is so much activity going on in the oil industry now to pay attention to activity that we hope that we're going to avoid anything like that in the future. 5 recurring themes in the offshore. Increasing mobility to reduce costs. Fixed drilling rigs Fixed drilling platforms is what we started with. We went to drilling tenders, we went to jackups, we went to submersibles, we went to semi-submersibles, and now we're into drill ships. All improvements in technology. A lot of it manifests in eliminating steel. Fixed platforms go to TLPs and stars and FPSOs, subsea completions, and subsea separation and pumping in order to reduce the amount of steel that you have to put in place to produce these things. And another theme, progress comes through stepwise learning rather than quantum leap breakthroughs. We went from 2D, we went from torsion bars, going out there with torsion bars, trying to figure out where the oil was. And then we got into seismic. Then we got 2D and 3D. They even got 4D out there so that they can look at something in this year, and in 5 years they can look at it again and find out what has been drained and what hasn't been drained, and they can go and redevelop those fields. So they can add the element of time to the 3D stuff. And then we found out that the ingenuity of development and production groups always rises to the challenges of the exploration successes in the frontiers. The exploration guys, they'll just go look for it wherever they think it is. It's like following the money, right? And production guys have risen to the challenge, ever deeper water. And finally, safety is mission critical, as we all could guess at this point. And I'm done. I thank you for your attention. Despite our interruptions, I have time for one more question. I can't see you, so you're going to have to shout it out, because I got this bright light in my eyes. I'll take care of that. Okay. Yeah, there's 2 questions back. I'll take them both. What?
So if we get a whole bunch of light crude, what do you think about exporting crude out of the United States?
We went through a long period of time where we had a lot of crude in the United States and we were exporting it. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have free trade. I mean, South Texas is awash in crude oil right now. We have more crude oil than we know what to do with, and the prices dropped down below world prices. Does that sound like the kind of free trade and free economy that we ought to have? It doesn't sound like it to me. So I'd say there's going to be a lot of pressure and maybe some success, hopefully, on being able to export crude. We can export products. And so you say, well, if you can export products, why can't you export crude? Well, we've got to protect the refining industry. They're all right. Don't worry about them. Yes?
When they build those tethers and they put them down in the ground, is that all done remotely? They don't have to go down there?
No, they don't have to go down there. No, it's all done. They do it all remotely. They got wonderful remote operated vehicles right now. They all look like R2-D2, but they all, there's guys on the ships with joysticks running those things down there, and they do the drive those suction piles down into the ground with remote operated machinery. So yeah, because divers can go down 200, 300, 400 feet, but then when they come back up, they got to sit in a tank for about 3 days before they can decompress, and so they don't like to send them down 12,000 feet.